Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 3 of the Garot podcast. I am your host, Chingachgook, and I am once again in studio with my co-host, Mr. Howard Roark. As a point of housekeeping, I'd like to address the audience at home briefly before we dive right into the topic of today's episode. If you are joining us for the first time on this episode, I'd like to say welcome in the most sincerest manner possible. For those of you who are returning, glad to have you back. But one thing I do feel it is important to acknowledge is that in this episode, we will be speaking in such a way that assumes that you, the audience, have already listened to previous episodes. So at this point, the contents of episode 1, and perhaps more importantly, the content of episode 2. In keeping with the idea of episode 1, what we are hoping to accomplish is to build out the toolkit, and in building out this conceptual toolkit, it will very naturally require us to build upon and unfold upon material that has already previously been established. So if you are listening to this episode for the first time and you have not listened to the previous episodes, my strong recommendation would be to go back, listen to those episodes, and then return here further. Of course, the order in which you listen to the episodes is entirely up to you, but please do note that it is very probable that there will be certain unfamiliar terms that will be thrown around. Of course, you will probably be able to infer the meaning from context, but for the sake of absolute clarity, you can always go back and listen to the previous episodes.
Particularly in the situation where you, as the listener, are confused by a set of terms that you might think are very odd, it's likely that your cognitive dissonance will be resolved by returning to a previous episode. These episodes are meant to be consumed in sequence, and they're structurally set up for that. So do them in order, and then you won't get lost.
So the subject of today's episode is one that I've had a little bit of trepidation over simply due to how big the topic can expand very rapidly. But nevertheless, like with the term meta that we were speaking about previously, this is a term that is very much entrenched in our own day-to-day parlance. And similar to what I was describing in previous episodes, this term is another one of those artifacts that when I have to confront a third party, I find myself in a unideal position of having to explain something that is so naturally a part of the landscape of our own discourse between the two of us. But then when I have to strip away the architecture of that landscape and to provide a freestanding definition to the term on its own to a generic third party, it's difficult. So that's what I hope to accomplish setting out to do this episode today. What's interesting about this is there's a couple of things that I want to acknowledge in the spirit of lateral drifting before we really start sinking in and digging down into any one particular point. Right off the bat, the term that we're going to be discussing today is logos. Now, what is interesting about logos is that it's very explicitly, if I dare say, not an English term. It's a Greek word. And in the sense that we are using it, that you and I use it, it is very much a term that is derived from a primary source, but there's a second layer over it. The primary source is from the scriptures itself, very much rooted in the idea of Christian theology. However, the way that you and I use the term logos is also very much derived and takes enormous inspiration from the work of Dr. Jordan Peterson. At this point, correct me if I'm wrong, Howard, but I understand you to have completed the entirety of Dr. Peterson's biblical lecture series. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So in this sense, you're in a more advantageous position than I, because though I have seen copious amounts of clips taken from his biblical lecture series, I actually haven't, at this current time, listen to the biblical lecture series from end to end. So in terms of Dr. Peterson's content, I will have to defer to you in terms of the way that he handles this material. But based on his other lectures, including those that he posted from his time at the University of Toronto, and then also from the clips that I have seen, he very much digs into the idea and the concept of the Logos as he derives it from the scriptures, and then uses that idea as a tool to then unfold what I would like to call a wider variety of deeper truths, for lack of better terms. So what I want to do right now is I actually would like to read a portion of the scripture where the term logos is usually associated most closely with, particularly in the context of Christian teaching and Christian doctrine, Christian theology. And then from there, what I want to do is kind of swing that into the way Dr. Peterson utilizes that term and analyzes that term, and then how that in turn created the platform upon which you and I founded a large portion of our discussions. And then from there, hopefully we can bring a definition of the Logos that is very portable and is easily and readily explainable to any generic third party listening in. Anything you'd like to say before I dive right in?
We are going to need to, at some point, also address some of the specifics of the definition itself. So I suppose we'll do that in the later phases or the later stages of what it is that you're talking about.
So this is the first 5 verses from the Gospel according to John, chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. So, directly translated, the Greek word logos means the word. Now, one of the things that I have observed repeatedly through Dr. Peterson's content and his lecture series that he's posted online is that he speaks about the idea of using the truth as the magic speech that calls existence into being. Using the magic speech to pull the order out of chaos. The examples that come to my mind are when he talks a lot about the Mesopotamian theology, and also he touches upon the ancient Egyptian mythology as well. There's this idea that there's an inherent power that comes with logos as truth, because I myself have personally been in situations where in my flailing attempts to improvise a definition of the logos to a third party, I've said things like, oh, it's like telling the truth. It's speaking the truth. Sometimes even in our own conversations, we use the term logos as a proxy for truth. There is a deep element of truth seated in this idea, and how that relates to the bringing forth of reality, if you will.
I would say that that's not a bad start. I would say that you touched on several vital components. It's not a comprehensive definition of the term.
Not at all. That's why we're here.
Fair enough.
So let's just riff on that a bit, because I am very much laterally drifting and trying to just set the stage for our audience of the landscape of what it is that we're trying to negotiate. I am very much in a position where I understand the concept of the logos, particularly as Dr. Peterson describes it and uses it in his content, but I am very much underprepared when it comes to articulating that with any sort of clarity outside of the context of either our discussions or even Dr. Peterson's work. And so the question that I'll open to you perhaps could be stated as follows. Given the setup that I just provided, how would you go about explaining the concept and a definition of the logos to a generic third party who, A, has no history of having ever read anything from the scriptures, B, has no history of ever interacting with any of Dr. Peterson's content?
Sure. So I suppose I can start out by granting you a couple of things. So despite your inability to explain, perhaps in a proper definition, when we use the term, as far as I understand the definition of the term, your usage of the term is accurate. You know how to use the term and apply it, even if it's not tangibly defined at that point. And you know what it is when you see it. So when I point at something and I talk about the logos, you understand what it is that I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a couple of components that I would like to layer on to what it is that you were just describing in the direction of explaining these things to a third party, which is what you were asking about. Exactly where to start isn't immediately as clear as I wish it was. So
Now
perhaps I'm the one that needs to laterally drift a little bit more. So let me respond to some of the things that I saw to be lacking with your description. Is that fair enough?
Go for it.
All right. So along with that is a reiteration of the things that were correct. One last little aside, as I look to describe this term, the logos, outside of the context of Dr. Peterson's lectures on the Genesis series, which I would consider a standard requirement for the general education of anyone. So if you want to have an education, that lecture series is a necessary part of your education and yours. So you should do that too.
No qualms here. Let me throw this in here as well. We're probably having to play in two different puddles at the moment, but obviously I'm not suggesting that we need to excise Dr. Peterson's content. What I'm hoping to be able to accomplish is to acknowledge how Dr. Peterson utilizes the concept of the logos in his lecture series, and then using that as a springboard to be able to shoot into a way to confront the generic third-party individual.
Well, if you understand the ideas themselves, there's a point where the ideas become more important than recognizing the author.
Mm-hmm.
And what you're asking for is a description of the idea itself that can then be attributed perhaps to a source, but we're not talking about an idea that can be discredited because of the author.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about an idea in and of itself that has a definition and a function, just like this idea can be used to refer to the scriptures and the logos as it applies to the word. That as well has a very valuable discussion that needs to be had in and around the idea of the logos itself, even if we're not talking about the sources, or we're not talking about the sources yet. So it's not imperative that someone gets the idea from a single source. That idea being valuable can be described outside of its original context comprehensively. That would be the claim.
Which is what we're trying to accomplish right now.
All right. The term itself, the logos. There are a couple of absolutely critical components to this term. One critical component to the term the logos is the spoken word, the ability to verbalize speech. The term the logos grants quite a lot of power, if not a kind of ultimate power, to speech itself. And it is a kind of magic words, if we're going to refer to Mesopotamia and Marduk in this case.
Yeah.
Is the Mesopotamian
mythological figure who embodies this.
Right. Figure who has eyes around his head speaks magic words. It might be nice to note that nobody would really care about magic words unless they improved things. So essentially, the idea of the logos would be the power of speaking the truth to bring the truth into existence. So essentially, you speak the truth into existence. And there are a couple of things that go along with that. Particularly, there's also the consequence factor. First of all, that it's even possible that what you say wouldn't exist unless you said it. But also, the ability to speak is the mechanism that generates order out of chaos in a way that makes things better. It's the best way to do that. Another effect would be to say, when using the logos, you speak the truth, and then the claim would be, whatever happens as a consequence of speaking the truth is good. So there's a very critical component to the logos, which states that you speak the truth and you let it land, and then you accept whatever the consequences are for doing that. Whatever happens as a result is going to be good. You might not know exactly what's going to happen. Sometimes you do. A lot of times you're just trying to get as close to the truth as possible. Just because you say what you think is the truth doesn't mean you're right. There's still room for error.
Let me throw this in here to see if this can provide some more directionality. And as I'm listening to you describe these attributes of the logos, one of the things that's coming to my mind is a memory that I have. Because ever since I personally started coming upon Dr. Peterson's content, particularly when he was talking about Mesopotamian myth, ancient Egyptian myth, scriptures, and particularly as the idea of the logos as it emerges from these very ancient civilizations. The memory that I have is me having a conversation with a particular individual. And I have a very vivid memory of trying to explain the concept of the logos, particularly as it is connected to truth. And the individual in question, who fulfilled the category of not knowing who Dr. Peterson is, of not having any background knowledge or understanding of either the scriptures or ancient Egyptian myth or ancient Mesopotamian myth, just looked at me and said, so logos just means truth. Why are you using this fancy word? So all this hullabaloo that you're talking about the logos, you're just talking about telling the truth. We can dispense of the term the logos and just say the truth. And we can save ourselves the necessity of having to define an archaic Greek word for the sake of being fancy. Now, the reason why this memory sticks out so strongly in my mind is because I knew that the person telling me this was wrong. There seems to be something embedded in the concept of the logos that is very intimately tied to the concept of the truth in general even, but that the two are not synonymous. There is something more to the concept of the logos than just truth. Because if we will just search and replace all instances of logos and just replace it with truth, something's missing.
Well, yes, there is something missing. I think that there's more than one thing missing. You cannot combine the terms truth and logos. You can, for example, not speak the truth. If you don't speak the truth, there is a truth that is unacknowledged, that you didn't vocalize.
Because truth doesn't require vocalization.
Correct.
That's the embedded concept of that.
You
And
must
that seems,
vocalize the logos.
perhaps we can ask ourselves this question: is the logos a noun or is the logos a verb? Because a term like truth, as a point of comparison, is very much a noun. It doesn't require any sort of action for the truth to be there. Let me just give a very basic example for this. The fact that the interior angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees, that's a truth. We may declare that to be a truth. And that is a truth that doesn't require vocalization. Even back in the days of the Upper Paleolithic, when human beings were still living in caves, drawing the cave paintings, and there was no concept of mathematics whatsoever, even at that time, the truth of the interior angles of a triangle adding up to 180 degrees still holds. It stands independent of any sort of acknowledgement. So I guess using that as a comparison, can we say the same thing about the logos? Does the logos require acknowledgement in order to be there? And that's just another way of saying, is the logos a noun or is the logos a verb?
Well, the logos is a process. So in the way that a process is a noun, I suppose, it's a sequence of events.
The logos is a sequence of events. So, for example, what's another just very generic sequence of events? An earthquake, I guess you can say. So an earthquake in English grammar is technically a noun, but it is, in essence, a sequence of events. Something has to be happening in order for an earthquake to be declared as existing. If nothing is happening, an earthquake in a given location does not exist.
We might have a normative versus descriptive problem.
Elaborate on that.
Well, the earthquake is a descriptive process. How do you say that the earthquake is good?
You don't. An earthquake is normatively neutral.
Right.
It's just there. The point of comparison that I was drawing is that it's a sequence of events. Because we're asking the question, is the logos a noun or a verb? And you're saying it's a sequence of events.
I'm not saying that the logos is only a sequence of events, because it's a specific category of events. So you were asking whether the logos was a noun or a verb, and in the way that a process is a noun, there are multiple pieces.
Right. So this is the reason why I brought up the example of the earthquake. In the way that a process is a noun, what I am trying to get at is the fact that processes are classified as nouns is a fault of grammar. You can even say particularly of English grammar in this case. So you were making a statement that the logos is a sequence of events. It's a process. So it is a noun in the sense that a process is a noun. We may regard processes as actions, as verbs that, due to linguistic happenstance, are perhaps misappropriately categorized as nouns, when they should more accurately be understood to be verbs. We may perhaps be able to apply this definition to processes in general. And another example that I pulled up would be an earthquake or a hurricane, a tornado. All these things are examples of processes. And although these processes are categorized as nouns in English, when we are trying to understand the nature of these things, they are actually far more intimately connected to the idea of verb, of action, than something like cup, something like lamp, something like paper.
Well,
something has to be happening.
There's something dynamic about the logos.
Correct.
Because the logos has consequences.
In the same way that there is something dynamic about hurricane and earthquake and tornado and what have you. There is this class of things where, yeah, they're quote-unquote nouns, but they're inherently dynamic. Versus truth, for example, is not inherently dynamic. Truth, by comparison, is static.
Okay.
Which goes back to the example of the interior angles of a triangle adding up to 180 degrees. Nothing has to be happening in order for that truth to exist.
Built into the term is the idea that these spoken words, and you have to actually speak them because you have to specify. That's another component, is the requirement to specify so that good things can exist and order can come from chaos. And those things that come into being as a result of these words and these things that are specified are good things.
So here's something that I can throw out here.
Doesn't mean that it's safe.
But here's the thing. If the generic individual was to declare, or either one of us were to declare to the generic individual, that the logos is that which brings order out of chaos, is that a definition or is that merely a description?
You need words to do it. You need words in the logos. You have to be speaking. You have to be saying something out loud. You can't just be thinking the logos. That doesn't apply.
Okay.
You have to actually say the words in order for them to take effect.
All right, so let's take stock of what we have at the moment. So the logos is a process. The logos is a sequence of events. The logos is dynamic. The logos requires something to be happening in order to exist. The logos has consequences. The logos requires speech, requires words, requires communication. And the logos is a process that brings order out of chaos via words. Does all that seem to stick? It seems to be on first glance, but again, what I'm running into, particularly as I take stock of my memories of my previous attempts to talk about this topic and to speak about this topic, is that these seem to be descriptors rather than definitions. Perhaps if we tried, the logos is the process by which words accomplish X. I'm pretty happy with that first part, but I'm not quite certain what to put into the position of X.
I don't want to get too far off the topic here and start talking about alternatives. That's somewhere else, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
All right. Because I could talk about the value of generating alternatives for a very long time.
And we will, but probably not in this go.
Well, the reason why I'm considering alternatives is when I'm thinking about the way that we would use this word, the way that we would describe things, it's a form of communication that the individual themselves knows is the best option in terms of the best thing that they know how to say in the context of their circumstances. Even though the consequences might be unfavorable at some level of analysis, that it's still more powerful over a long enough timeline. There's also a process for acknowledging what the logos is at the individual level. And the way that you figure out what we might refer to as the logos option when we're talking to each other is the option where everything is stripped away and it's just the most efficient way of getting at the truth of the situation at hand, the way that things actually are, and what it means at the level of meta or tangibility that we're operating under for those circumstances.
So then riffing off that, let's try this. Let me try throwing this out there and let me see what you think. The logos is the process by which words are used to provide the best possible option in any given situation.
I'm just trying to break that apart a little bit. So the process by which words
are used to provide the best possible option in any given circumstance. Which embedded in that presumes that there's a choice to be made.
And the question of best is also considered. You don't get to discuss the logos without considering the question of what's best.
Right.
Words are used to provide the best possible option in any given circumstance. It's better. It's closer.
How can we refine that down? It looks nice on first glance. I'm just trying to figure out if there's a situation where that is an insufficient definition. It once again falls into the category of description as opposed to a definition.
That definition might be our best possible option in this given circumstance.
Hurrah for self-referential coherency, I guess.
The logos is also self-referentially coherent. Always.
Well, I mean, that's kind of covered in the term best. Because if something is not self-referentially coherent, it's not the best.
That's fine. I'll accept that.
So the definition of the logos that we can settle upon, particularly in the context of the generic third-party individual who is completely unfamiliar with the landscape that we've been describing, is that the logos is the process by which words are used to provide the best possible option in any given circumstance.
If that's to be refined, it's going to be refined under thumb-down examples.
Yeah, but thumb up, it seems pretty good to me.
I need to vet it and cross-examine it with thumb-down examples and feeding it into the machine, so to speak.
Well, why don't we try taking a bit of a crack?
I don't have any immediate objections to that definition as it stands. Particularly, that's a significant upgrade to the initial description that you made of the term.
So one of the ways that we can play around with the idea of thumb-down examples is to start talking about the ways in which even I myself personally have observed the logos being derailed in my attempts to speak about this with other people. And so with this definition, let's see if this definition that we have right now is able to explain the mechanisms by which derailment occurs.
Okay. That's supposed to imply that derailment is a function of something other than the logos.
Correct.
It should follow that derailment is not the best possible option.
Correct. So let me give the...
I mean, maybe it is, but you have to really spin a narrative in order to justify that. It's going to be an exception more than a rule.
Well, let me try this example that I've had to deal with more than once and from multiple different people. One of my recurrent problems of trying to talk about the logos to other people has been rooted in my difficulty pertaining to being able to adequately separate the term logos and truth. Because what starts happening is that the two start getting conflated. So what happens in these multiple examples that I myself have observed and experienced is that the conversation and the situation devolves into something of ad hominem, where the individual in question says, "Oh, you are so arrogant to think that you have 100% say-so on what the truth is, and you think that you know the entirety of the truth, and you're just so narrow-minded in what you believe to be the truth, and you dismiss everybody else who doesn't accord with your understanding of the truth, and you're a big poopy head."
Well, I have a clarifying question. Is the context of this hypothetical situation a discussion about the logos itself, or a discussion about something else that you're trying to apply the term logos to?
I have examples of both.
Could you choose a place to start, please?
You mean an example?
I can choose one for you if you...
Yeah, you go and you choose. It'd be easier.
All right. So could you give me an example in this hypothetical of someone who is...
It's not even a hypothetical. I mean, I am declaring that these are things that I have observed with my own eyes.
I'm analyzing it as a hypothetical, so fair enough. We're going to need to be able to change and substitute the variables of this anyways, so... Did someone use ad hominem for the definition of the logos? Did this come up in a context where you were trying to say the logos? Does this happen in a sequence where first you're trying to say something and then you have to try and define the logos and then the logos is rejected? Or maybe I'm missing the gap between how you're coming to talk about the logos in the first place before it gets rejected by, for example, ad hominem.
Well, like I said, I have examples of both.
I would prefer to start with an example of a context self-contained within the logos itself, without its application to a secondary context.
Sure. That would be the situation where I was asked a very poor quality, very low resolution question pertaining to, for lack of better terms, let's just say life goals, life pursuits. What are you doing with your life? Very intangible questions. That was the setup. So because of the woefully intangible setup of the conversation from the get-go, in the situation that I'm referring to, what happened was I was trying to pivot an intangible conversation to a tangible direction by using the idea of the logos as the primary tool to explain my own personal decision principles. Because if you really want the greater context, this was an individual who was questioning and could not understand various decision principles that I was taking, particularly with regards to how it was that I was living my life, and certain life decisions and the strategies that have led me to these certain life decisions. And this individual was just asking, well, why this? Why aren't you living a far more stereotypical, generic life, making far more generic, I would even dare to say, low-quality decisions? And so those intangible platitudes became a setup for me to try to speak about the logos. And then as I tried to bring the logos into more articulated form, that created a situation in which the term logos and truth were insufficiently distinguished from one another, and then that's when the ad hominem came in.
I'm not sure if we need to put truth into this definition somewhere, but we've already addressed the differences between the logos and the truth, and that they're not the same, and that the truth can go unspoken, but the logos cannot. Well, I mean, you can acknowledge the logos and then ignore it and not speak it, but that's not supposed to be your best option, so...
Right. I mean, that just goes back to what we were talking about earlier. It is accurate to say that the idea of the logos is far more something of a verb as opposed to something of a noun, which is just to say that the logos is inherently dynamic. It cannot be static.
Well, yeah, it changes things. So in this situation, if we're going to try and use this example, you were trying to describe the logos, and then this person looked at you and called you a name?
Yeah.
Okay. They're using their words to call you a name is not the best option for their response. There's a lot of better options for them to respond with, such as a direct question for trying to understand what it is that you're saying. Is that problem already resolved with this definition? What I'm trying to consider is a situation like this where someone is asking you, what are your life goals? Which is obviously a very disingenuous question. You ended up providing a secondary context. So,
if that qualifies as a secondary context, then maybe I have no examples that lack a secondary context, because there was never a situation in which two people walked into a room, said absolutely nothing, and then immediately started saying, the logos is A, B, C, D, E. It always arose from something.
well, sure.
But the example that I just cited right
I
now
see.
wasn't a situation in which there was a dispute of any kind.
So would this be a situation where someone says to you, or someone says in general, what are your life goals? And then the response is something to the effect of, I'm trying to create good things by pursuing the truth, something like that, in its lower resolution format. And then the response then to trying to create good things by pursuing the truth would be, for example, you don't know what the truth is? You don't actually know what the truth is?
Yeah.
Okay, so then the follow-up for that would be, is the implication that the individual making this statement knows what the truth is? Are they saying this in such a way where they're saying, you don't know what the truth is, but I do?
It depends on the example in question. I have witnessed both.
Okay. Both that your accuser in this case knows the truth, or simply that there isn't a such thing as truth at all?
I have seen both.
I see.
So depending on which example you want to talk about, I have examples that can fulfill either one of those categories.
All right. I would prefer to start with the example of someone who says that they know what the truth is.
Hmm.
And I suppose that would be part of the implication by saying you don't know the truth in such a way where they're saying you don't know the truth, but I do.
Hmm.
So did you ask them what the truth was?
Yes,
Okay.
I did.
Did they tell you?
This person did not provide any kind of thumb up definitions. Everything was completely locked thumb down. So in the example that I'm thinking of, this was a situation where the person in question declared, you need to do X, Y, Z. You just need to do what I am telling you. And any sort of attempt of trying to say that you have some sort of higher connection to a thumb up understanding of truth is arrogant and closed minded. That was another ad hominem from that particular example.
So we have a person who is saying, you don't know the truth, I do. And if you say that you know the truth and that it's different than mine, or what I'm saying is the truth, then you are arrogant and closed-minded, despite the fact that I don't really have anything to offer you in terms of an educational inquiry to teach you what the truth actually is, and despite the fact that I don't care about listening to anything that you have to say to me in terms of any kinds of corrections, I'm going to project onto you that you are the one that's being closed-minded.
Yes. Also, there have been ad hominem attacks of brainwashed. Another one that comes out in these sorts of examples is biased. Now, we're going to have to sort of dig into that probably at a later time. Oh, another one that comes out of that is immature. But basically, the commonality in all of these ad hominem attacks, well, the ad hominem of bias, the ad hominem of brainwashed, the ad hominem of immature usually belongs to the category of there's some kind of dispute on another secondary category of something. In the instance where there is no specific dispute that gives rise to a discussion of the logos, the ad hominem is usually dismissal by arrogance.
Which is an arrogant thing to do, so
Right.
Don't do that.
Because one of the things that comes up with that is the proclamation that declares, oh, you person who is trying to provide the definition of the logos, how do you know what is the better option? You declare options A and B, and you're saying that A is better than B. How do you know that A is better than B? That's just your opinion that A is better than B. You don't actually know that A is better than B.
Again, not the best option. One of the things that came to mind when you were talking about some of these examples where this started with, for example, someone who says, I know the truth and you don't, or someone who says that there is not truth that's knowable in terms of any kind of epistemic certainty. These are both heinous responses to the logos. And anyone who's considering the question of what's best isn't going to be responding this way. So, are you asking about how to confront someone in this hypothetical situation? Or are you trying to give advice to someone who might try and confront someone in that way? What's the direction that you want to take this hypothetical?
More so the first. The primary reason why I would err on the former more than the latter is because I am granting to our audience at home a certain level of curiosity. The people who would fall into the category of the latter, I presume would not be individuals with the patience to be listening to this podcast. By choosing the former over the latter, I'm trying to grant a level of respect to our audience that I would not expect from someone who has a knee-jerk active opposition to the logos.
Or even to the definitions as we were previously looking at them.
Correct.
Fair enough. So if the question is, how do you continue the conversation when someone does that? Is that the question at hand?
We can pursue that direction. I just do want to acknowledge the anchor point that led us to this particular spot was that we have a fairly nicely upgraded definition of the logos on hand. I'm trying to see if talking about these other points of how derailment occurs can demonstrate that the definition that we have on hand is insufficient somehow.
So let me lay out this hypothetical then. Someone says this definition of the logos, just by way of an example, that the logos is the process by which words are used to provide the best possible option in any given circumstance. And the response to that is, you're dumb. That spoken phrase, those words that are utilized in a way of name calling, those words are not the logos in this circumstance. The rejection of the definition and the inability to seek the best possible option given the circumstances at hand would not be the best possible option for how to use words.
I just thought of a very dark turn I also want to throw out there before I lose it.
Sure.
And that's the following question. True or false? Providing the best possible option in any given circumstance requires words. Now, here's the follow-up to that. There do exist individuals who look at that question and declare false. Does not require words. I just know what the best possible option is. Doesn't require words.
Well, there are options that don't require specification first, which would not be considered the logos. You can't separate words and logos, but you can separate the best option from whether it's specified.
Is it possible to know the best option without specifying it? This is sort of a segue that I'm predicting we'll probably revisit in a later episode, but it's one of those things that we need to acknowledge because what we're trying to do in this exercise is account for the variety of ways in which this definition of the logos can be subjuncted from the generic individual. What are the variety of ways in which the generic individual can look at this definition of the logos and say no?
Well, the logos is oftentimes a kind of improvement mechanism, although it does generate order out of chaos that wasn't ordered before in terms of establishing function. In a situation like, for example, where you need to know the best possible option in the circumstance of physical combat, you're not going to say what you're going to do before you do it every time. That would be an example of something where you just know what to do. Or you know what to do because of the motor skills that you have, and it's a function of knowing what to do that doesn't require...
It's intuitive.
Well, right. It's a way to understand what you need to do in a physical environment because you know what to do with your body in that physical environment, which is why people don't walk around talking to themselves all the time everywhere they go, even though they're doing the best option that they have. Maybe they specified it beforehand, but maybe I can format it this way. The logos is a reliable means to the best option. That doesn't mean that there aren't other ways to the best option.
Let me throw this on top of it. Can we say that the logos is the most reliable way to the best option? That doesn't necessarily mean that there are not other ways to the best option, but the logos is the most reliable way to the best option.
I think that that's better. There seems to be some more room for this to still improve, but in terms of what I'm able to manage with it currently, I don't think that, for example, if you don't have the logos, you definitely don't have the best option. But if you have the logos, you do have the best option.
So then I think that putting in the term most actually covers that fairly nicely. So then what that turns into is the logos is the process by which words are used to provide in the most reliable way the best possible option in any given circumstance. Or is the most reliable way improperly placed? Maybe we need to move it closer to the term words. Let me adjust that. Let's move the most reliable means up closer to the process.
I was just going to say before process.
Right. Logos is the most reliable process by which words are used to provide the best possible option in any given circumstance. That's a lot cleaner. I like that.
Okay. This might be able to become more concise too. There are just a lot of variables that we're trying to account for.
But
sure.
Its verboseness aside temporarily, I kind of like that format.
Most reliable process by which words are used to provide the best possible option in any given circumstance. Okay.
And let me put in a little commentary about why I really like the way this is coming together. Because it also very cleanly answers the relativism pushback.
Okay.
It very cleanly answers the pushback that declares your logos, my logos. This is your logos. This is the way you do things. I have a different logos. No. There's only one logos. I am not going to deny that you, generic individual, may have a method to be able to approximate the best possible option in a given circumstance, but I am declaring that it is inferior to the logos.
Well, there's only one best option.
Right.
So you don't get two best options. You can't say my logos, your logos, because that means that we both have the best option, which are different things, and that's a contradiction.
Right.
So there's only one best option, which means either my option is the best option, or in this case, for example, your option is the best option, and whoever has the best option, the logos overtakes the other one.
And here's the thing. It also very cleanly answers the retort of, how do you know what's best? Oh, that's your opinion. You think that this is the best, but actually this other thing is the best, and other people think this other thing is the best. And there's really no way to objectively define best because that's just your bias. No. Because the way that you measure best is everything that you can do plus more. So, generic individual, you declare that you have another way to approximate the best possible option in a given circumstance that is not the logos as it is here defined. It's a different method. And you're saying that your way is better than the logos. All right, well, how do we determine that? Well, can the logos do everything that your way does plus more? Can your way do everything the logos does plus more? And that becomes a very objective measuring stick. And that's how you can say you might have some magic wand that will get you to the best possible option in a given set of circumstances, but I am telling you that it's not as good as the logos. Because not only does it get you to the best possible option, it gives you all this other stuff too. And that's even assuming what the generic individual is describing actually gets them to the best possible option.
I just wanted to also make sure that that doesn't indicate that you get to keep adding things to the definition so as to make the definition intangible. So when you say everything before plus more, I suppose if you're adding things that are intangible, then there's a way to procedurally recognize that that's adding more obstacles rather than more tools.
Because if you add something that's intangible, that's not an addition, that's a subtraction.
Well, right, well, it's an addition of obstacles.
Correct.
Well, that would be consistent by saying that the logos is the best possible option, or the option at the top of that hierarchy of options, in that there's a way to overtake the definition, but in order to overtake the definition, you must provide an alternative. You have to replace it with something.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, the rejection of the logos becomes a problem that accompanies intangibility problems, where the rejection of the logos is very convenient for someone that isn't able to generate an alternative but sees that the consequences of the logos are unfavorable for them.
I like that. Elaborate more on it for our audience.
Well, you're describing a situation where people are confronting you about the logos or otherwise, either the logos directly or another statement that is made using the logos. So you basically can identify a statement as the logos option for how to handle a given situation. It requires alternatives in order to generate those options so that you have something to choose and then you have the best option that you can choose. The person that is opposed and uses any of these tactics, such as name-calling, ad hominem,
Appeal to relativism.
the appeal to relativism by saying that you can have your logos and I can have my logos, you can have your truth, I can have my truth, and you can have your math and I can have my math. They don't have to add up, it's fine. Someone who doesn't want to put the effort into generating the alternatives that are actually going to make things better and doesn't have a way to otherwise concede to the fact that the best option going forward is for them to face the consequences of something that they've already made a decision around, that can be difficult for someone to face and to concede to. It can be difficult for someone to realize that the best option is for them to consider or admit to whether they were wrong on a certain topic. But in the face of the logos, unless you can overturn it, the logos creates the state of the world. So sometimes someone finds it more convenient or more expedient to reject the logos rather than face the consequences of their decisions that weren't the best decisions. There's an improvement process that they're not willing to engage in. It creates a situation where they're wrong, but they're still going to fight what's right because that's easier than trying to do the work of generating the better alternative. I'm trying to account for why these heinous individuals would attack the idea of truth itself. And that's the best understanding that I have of what would motivate or incentivize someone to do that is the appeal to a nihilistic abdication of responsibility, for lack of a better way of referring to it at the moment. You don't have the responsibility of accepting the consequences of the logos when you reject the logos. But you also don't have the consequences of the logos when you do that. And the consequences of the logos are good. The logos is a situation where it's not the easy option, but it's the important option. It shouldn't be so far-fetched to say that the best possible option, once you've actually gone through the work of generating it, in almost all circumstances, that best possible option isn't going to be the easiest choice that you can make. So the idea of figuring out the logos in the first place, figuring out this is the most accurate way to describe the world as it is, the truth that I want to bring into being, what I want to actually see in the world. The people that resist that idea aren't themselves thinking about the best idea of what they want to see in the world. And then there's a question of, well, how do you manage that? Or going back to this question of how do you respond to someone who tries to tell you that the logos isn't important, or that there's no such thing as truth, or that reason doesn't exist, even though you need reason to make that claim? What do you do with someone like that? And the logos has an answer to all these questions. In your case, you were describing it as best as you could at the time, and it gave you a situation where you learned something about the person that you were talking to. Someone who's rejecting the logos, it means that they're rejecting their best options. Or at the very least, I suppose, by the definition that we're providing, they're rejecting the most reliable process, which is a means to the best of possible options. I would go so far as to say a rejection of the most reliable process is going to lead you to maybe get lucky sometimes, but it's not going to be a reliable situation where you have the best possible options.
By definition, it's inconsistent.
Right. And by definition, it's not better. It's a matter of trying to figure out how to get someone to understand that this is of vital importance to consider and to utilize and to practice and to develop as a skill, especially someone that's not doing it or someone who is actively resisting. Sometimes the example needs to be set first in terms of the educational procedure for someone that rejects the Logos and trying to get them to question their premises in a way that they would be receptive to. That's very, very challenging.
But what we seem to have here is a definition of the Logos that, insofar as I can tell, given what we've been doing in this episode, withstands antagonistic scrutiny.
Well, that's an easy substitution to make in terms of the variables. I'm not sure how you would answer the question now if someone were to ask you, what are you doing with your life?
Or other such
intangible questions. What's the adjustment to the strategy that you would make in terms of generating the thumb up response? Or just putting it into some kind of a hypothetical?
Well, the thumb up response would be, I am pursuing those options that the Logos has revealed to me to be the best. I have a set of choices that I need to make. A wide variety of different subjects, a wide variety of different categories. And thankfully, I have found the mechanism that reveals to me what those best options are every single time. No matter what category I put this tool in, out it comes. There's the best option. And so what I am doing is I am guarding this tool with all the might and strength that I have so I can maintain it and keep using it in any category that I need to use it. And every single time I am presented with a question, I drop it into the magic Logos machine. To use the way Dr. Peterson describes Marduk, the magic speech. I confront a question, I confront a set of decisions and choices that I need to make, and I use the magic speech to command into existence the best option to step forward. And it happens every time. And that is what I am doing.
And the consequences are good. And they're reliably good.
Mm-hmm. And that's perhaps exactly the reason why Marduk's speech is described with the word magic. What are you doing with your life? I am unleashing the Logos upon every aspect of my life that I can unleash it upon.
That you can manage.
That is what I am doing with my life. Should that not be what we are all doing with our lives?
Yeah, it's universalizable.
Every human being is capable and ought to do this. When it comes to completing this task, when it comes to accomplishing this task of being able to call forth the best possible option in any given set of circumstances, and you have the tool, the magic word that can do it, why would you give that up for anything? Nothing beats it. And like you said, that's not to say there might not exist alternative mechanisms to get to the best possible option, but it's not as reliable, it's not as good. Because not only can the best option be made known, it can be made articulated. It can be described to anyone who listens.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just something that's stuck in your own head.
Well, it's not in your own head when it's the Logos and you speak it. It's now into the world.
And if I may, the Gospel according to John, chapter 1, verse 3, all things were made by him, the Logos, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Anything else you'd like to add?
Well, the general definition of the Logos starts with the beginning, in the beginning. So there are other ways to defend the term the Logos in terms of the meta as it applies to Scripture, but I don't know if that's useful to layer onto there or not. It's hard for me to tell. Do we need to talk about the process itself? Or did we already talk about the process itself because of the tangibility of generating alternatives?
Well, we kind of alluded to the process itself, particularly in the context of the necessity to use words.
Mm-hmm.
But it's actually very fortuitous that you bring this up because of what we're going to talk about in the very next episode. How that process comes about in the way that words are used to explore and probe and drill and mine the best option. What does that process look like? How can that process be described? Will very much be the crux of episode 4. It's sufficient to acknowledge that this definition of the logos that we have right now works to explain to the generic third-party individual who is unfamiliar with Mesopotamian lore, is unfamiliar with Egyptian lore, is unfamiliar with scripture, is unfamiliar with any of Dr. Peterson's content.
That's Maps of Meaning, by the way. There's a separate lecture series for Maps of Meaning, which I would also highly recommend.
As would I. It seems to be that this definition encapsulates in a single unit exactly the information required in order to understand what the logos is and its significance and its importance and the nature of why it's imperative.
It, at the very least, is accounting for all the variables that I'm setting out to account for at the moment. There's that edge of what's manageable, because the logos has to also be something manageable.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be something that you can handle the consequences of as well. And what I mean by that is, if I look at this definition and I call this the logos, this definition, if I'm applying even this definition to itself in the circumstances of our trying to figure out how to describe it properly, it is the best definition that we have. And neither of us can overturn it, and we both agree. And if either of us can overturn this with something better, then we would both agree that it's better, and then that option has become better.
But that's not an overturning, that's an updating.
Well, sure, when I say overturn, it just means that it's replaced by something else, even if it's modified in some way. It might be replaced by a slightly modified version, where you're switching around the words a little bit. But the logos version is the best one that you have. So this definition would be the logos version of the definition of logos. And it's at the edge of what we can manage as speaking the truth for what it is that we're trying to define. It's the best that we can do, which is what the definition is also trying to account for. So I'm looking at this definition trying to make it better, and maybe we can make it better. But that's the best that it can be at the moment that I'm speaking and given these circumstances that I'm in. It's at that upper edge of trying to even generate what the best option could possibly be. That's the best thing that I can possibly think of. And I'm going to say it out loud. Logos.
Anything else?
Anything else that I would have to contribute would be a form of summary or otherwise repeating myself. So I think that that's sufficient.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been the Garot Podcast. So, until next time, Vido Grigo Esperante. Keep breathing, everyone.